My life started just north of here in Chicago in 1942. I died at age 66, so I really didn't have a long life, but I packed a lot into it while I was here. My father, John, was a journalist, and my mother, Zula, was a homemaker. I was raised in Long Island with my two sisters, Kimberly and Catherine, and my younger brother, Douglas. As an adolescent, I felt isolated because of my height. I was 6'9". I always had been interested in writing. I had an article published in the New York Times when I was only 16. So my plan was to become a writer when I started at Harvard in 1960. During my undergrad study in literature, I had a professor who gave me low marks and criticized me for no good reason. So I decided to conduct a little experiment to expose him. I told another professor about my suspicions, and then turned in a paper by George Orwell under my name. I got a B-. If I was going to be open to such subjective grading when Orwell gets a B-, I figured I might as well drop English as a major. I graduated summa cum laude, receiving my bachelor's degree in biological anthropology in 1965. Next, I enrolled in the Harvard School of Medicine. About 2 weeks into medical school, I realized I hated it. This isn't unusual since everyone hates medical school. I saw it through and received an MD in 1969. But I never practiced medicine. I was a postdoctoral fellow at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies, researching public policy. I also taught courses in anthropology at Cambridge University and writing at MIT. Rather than practicing medicine, I decided to go back to Plan A and focus on my writing. That medical degree wasn't a total waste of time. I put it to use in my writing. My first bestseller, The Andromeda Strain, was published while I was still a med student. In those early years, I was publishing under pseudonyms like John Lang for the book Dealing. I used the pen name Michael Douglas because I wrote it with my brother Douglas. How's this for a process? I wrote it completely from beginning to end. Then Doug rewrote it from beginning to end. And then I rewrote it again. This novel was made into a movie in 1972. Around the same time, I also wrote a couple of original screenplays. In addition to fiction, I wrote books based on medical or scientific themes, often based upon my own observations. In 1970, I published 5 Patients, which recounts my experiences of hospital practices in the late 1960s at Massachusetts General in Boston. The book follows 5 different patients through their hospital experience, revealing inadequacies in the hospital at the time. I discuss the costs and politics of American healthcare. Based on this book, I wrote a pilot script in 1974 for a medical series, 24 Hours. Unfortunately, networks were not enthusiastic. I was having better luck with movies. The Terminal Man, which I wrote in 1972, explored my preoccupation with machine-human interaction and technology. It was adapted into a 1974 movie, starring George Segal. ABC wanted the film rights to my novel Binary, so I said okay, provided I could direct the film. The result was a movie called Pursuit, and it was a ratings success. I also wrote and directed the feature film Westworld. It was the first to employ CGI special effects all the way back in 1973. It also contains one of the earliest references to a computer virus. I enjoyed working with computers. In 1983, I wrote Electronic Life, a nonfiction book that introduced basic programming to readers. The book was intended to introduce the idea of personal computers to a reader who might be faced with the hardship of using them at work or home for the first time. In this book, I predicted that computer networks would increase in importance as a matter of convenience, including the sharing of information and pictures that we see online today. And so I kept going, working my way through the 70s and 80s, writing and occasionally directing. But the 90s. The 90s were my decade. In 1990, I published a cautionary tale about what happens when man messes with nature. You've probably heard of it. Jurassic Park. The novel started out as a screenplay I wrote in 1983 about a graduate student who recreates a dinosaur. Then I decided to put off exploring my fascination with dinosaurs and cloning until years later when I turned the story into a novel. When I revisited it, I reasoned that genetic research is expensive and there is no pressing need to create a dinosaur. I concluded it would emerge from a desire to entertain, leading to a wildlife park of extinct animals. Originally, the story was told from a child's point of view, but I changed it since everyone who read the draft felt it would be better if told by an adult. I had met Steven Spielberg in the 70s when I first sold the Andromeda strain to Universal. One of Steven's first assignments at Universal was to show me around the lot. We became friends. Spielberg learned of Jurassic Park in late 1989 while we were discussing another screenplay. This put me in an inevitable position. Before the book was even published, I demanded a non-negotiable fee of $1.5 million as well as a substantial percentage of the gross. Thus began the bidding war. Warner Brothers and Tim Burton, Sony and Richard Donner, and 20th Century Fox and Joe Dante all bid. But Universal acquired the rights in May 1990 for Spielberg. Universal then paid me another $500,000 to adapt my own novel. The book was fairly long, so the script only used about 10 to 20% of the novel's content. You know what they say, the book is always better than the movie. The film was released in 1993 and became one of the highest grossing movies of all time. I pushed Spielberg to include CGI special effects in the movie. For my pioneering use of computer programs in film production, dating back to Westworld, I was awarded the Academy Award for Technical Achievement in 1995. Prior to Jurassic Park's release, I published Rising Sun in 1992, which was an international best-selling crime thriller. That book was adapted into a movie also coming out in 1993, starring Sean Connery and Wesley Snipes. In 1994, I published Disclosure. The film starring Michael Douglas and Demi Moore came out about that same year. Oh, and remember that script I was discussing with Spielberg when he learned about Jurassic Park? I had decided to revisit the script 24 hours, which I had written nearly 20 years earlier. Spielberg helped me develop into a TV show, ER. This time, the networks were interested. I was the creator and executive producer of this drama. Spielberg served as an executive producer for season 1 and offered me good advice. For example, he's the only reason Juliana Margulies became a regular. I had planned to kill her off in the pilot. ER won me an Emmy, a Peabody, and a Writers Guild of America award. I published The Lost World in 1995. Spielberg directed this Jurassic Park sequel in 1997. My work on the Jurassic series garnered me a very unusual honor. A newly discovered Ankylosaurus was named for me in 2002. Crichtonsaurus bolini. Spielberg and I teamed up again in 1996 when I wrote another blockbuster, Twister. The Anne-Marie was my wife at the time. That marriage actually was my longest. We were married for 16 years, and she was the mother of my daughter, Taylor Ann. My first marriage was to Joan Rodham in 1965 and lasted for 5 years. My next 2 marriages to Kathleen St. John's and Susanna Childs only lasted 2 years apiece. I was married to Anne-Marie from 1987 to 2003. After we divorced, I married my last wife, Sherry Alexander, in 2005. Sherry was 6 months pregnant with our son, John Michael Todd Crichton, at the time of my death. Admittingly, I was a workaholic, which many have contributed to the demise of my first 4 marriages. When drafting a novel, which could typically take me 6 to 7 weeks, I withdrew completely to follow what I called a structured approach of ritualistic self-denial. As I neared writing the end of each book, I would rise and keep increasingly earlier each day, usually meaning less than 4 hours of sleep for me, from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. So I may have been difficult to live with. But I also was ranked among People's Magazine's 50 most beautiful people in 1992. But back to the 90s. I finished out the decade by publishing Timeline in 1999. This sci-fi novel sees experts time travel back to the medieval period. It addresses quantum physics and time travel directly and received a warm welcome from medieval scholars who praised my depiction. In 2002, I published Prairie, about developments in science and nanotechnology. It explores recent phenomena engendered by the work of the scientific community, such as artificial life, genetic algorithms, and agent-based computing. In 2004, I published State of Fear, a novel concerning eco-terrorists who attempt mass murder to support their views. The novel's central premise is that climate scientists exaggerated global warming. President George W. Bush was a huge fan of this novel, and we met to discuss the book. We talked for an hour, and were in near total agreement, even though I previously had donated to Democratic campaigns and supported Prairie in '96. State of Fear may have been a fictional work, but I did have strong opinions and attacked the science behind global warming. I even testified on the subject before Congress in 2005. In 2007, Al Gore said before a U.S. House committee, "The planet has a fever. If your baby has a fever, you go to the doctor. If your doctor tells you you need to intervene here, you don't say, well, I read a science fiction novel that tells me it's not a problem." Lots of people have interpreted this as a reference to State of Fear. Maybe he was still upset about the whole Perot in '96 thing. In 2006, my last novel to be published while I was alive was released. The novel Next follows many characters in a quest to survive in a world dominated by genetic research, corporate greed, and legal intervention. The same year I clashed with a journalist named Michael Crowley, a Yale graduate. He was senior editor at the New Republic magazine and had written a strongly critical review of State of Fear because of my stance on global warming. Coincidentally, my book Next contained a minor character named Mick Crowley, who was also a Yale graduate and a political columnist. The character also happens to be a child molester. Michael thought it was intentional and decided to sue me, alleging that the character had libeled him. He wasn't the first to sue me. I considered myself a bit of an expert in intellectual property law since I had been involved in several lawsuits with others claiming credit for my work. In most of these cases, a judge granted summary judgment or ruled in my favor. Only one made it all the way to a jury trial. In 1998, a guy named Stephen Kessler tried to claim that Twister was based on his work titled Catch the Wind. It took the jury only 45 minutes to reach a verdict in my favor. Afterward, I refused to shake Kessler's hand. Let me summarize these legal cases. I always win. In early 2008, I was diagnosed with lymphoma. Since I like to keep my private life private, my cancer was not made known to the public until my death. I was undergoing chemotherapy at the time, and my doctors and family had been expecting me to recover. Instead, I died rather quickly, on November 4th. My old friend Steven Spielberg said, "Michael was a gentle soul who reserved his flamboyant side for his novels. There is no one in the wings that will ever take his place." Since I've died, more of my work has been published posthumously. The first, Pirate Latitudes, was found as a manuscript on one of my computers. The next book, Micro, had a completed outline and was about a third of the way done. Richard Preston finished it using my notes and files. Another was a book I actually had written in 1974. In 2019, it was announced that some of my works are being continued by other authors, such as The Andromeda Evolution. Just last December, it was announced that James Patterson will co-author a novel about a mega eruption of Hawaii's Mauna Loa volcano based on one of my unfinished manuscripts. It is set to publish next year. I became one of the most popular writers in the world, selling over 2 million books. My books have been translated into 38 languages, and 13 have been made into films. All in all, I managed to get a lot accomplished in my 66 years.
Marion Hume on May 26th of 1938 in Blackheath, London, England. My father, Dr. Henry Rainsford Hume, was a brilliant physicist who later was a leader in Britain's atomic weapon research. My mother, Hilda Marion Bradley Hume, worked as a marriage counselor. I spent my earliest years moving around, a bit during and immediately after that war. At age 6, I was severely ill, so much so that the doctor told my mother he would be back in the morning to sign my death certificate. However, I had a lot more illness, and at 8, I was sent to the Bahamas to live with a family who fostered me, and thus saved my life. After the Bahamas, they moved to a private island off the coast of New Zealand, where I lived a Swiss Family Robinson style of independence. We did a lot of fishing, building, boating, and more. By the time I was 10, I had missed 3 years of schooling. Fortunately, my mother had taught me to read and write by the time I was 4, so I always loved books and was able to catch up. I attended Christ Church Girls High School and met my best friend, Pauline Parker. She was 16 and I 15. We spent a great deal of time together writing plays, books, and stories set in our own secret world. We even invented our own private religion and version of utopia that we referred to as the Fourth World. It was at this time, in 1954, that my parents decided to separate and send me to South Africa to live with relatives. Of course, as close of friends as I was with Pauline, neither one of us could tolerate the idea of being separated. What would become of our plans to go to Hollywood or New York and publish our writings? With us desperate to remain together, and Pauline certain her mother, Honora Reaper, would not allow her to go with me, we decided we must kill her mother. I was certain that I must follow this course, as I owed it to Pauline, who had remained a true friend to me during my hospitalization. I was certain that if I did not help Pauline, that she would kill herself, and I could not bear a world without her. I truly believed she would take her life. So, on June 22nd of 1954, we took a brick, wrapped in a stocking, and struck Pauline's mom repeatedly when she bent down to pick up a decorative stone Pauline purposely dropped. I believe in the courtroom they surmised it to over 20 times. We then ran to the tea shop we had eaten earlier and told them that Pauline's mom had fallen and hit her head. The police were summoned. We were not the best masterminds, for when the police quickly discovered the murder weapon, our story quickly unraveled. At my arrest and conviction, I was sent to prison in New Zealand. Fortunately, because of our age, we were too young for the death penalty. Upon my release after serving 5 years, I was given a new identity, as was Pauline. We were told to never make contact again. We abided by that promise because we had been told that if we violated it, we would be served prison again. I took the opportunity to bury my past and create a new life for myself. However, it did not remain buried. In the summer of 1994, when word leaked out that Peter Jackson was going to recount the story of the murder in his film, heavenly creatures. My past crime was exposed. When the facts were disclosed, I fully admitted the truth. I do add that I feel that if someone had repented and goes on to do much good, that is that in which is done in the end that is of most importance. But let's not dwell further on all that. I moved on after my release. I held several jobs, but I seriously just desired to write. It was my father who was responsible for encouraging me to write down my ideas. However, I was in my 20s before I started putting together the first semi-balance of a book. My first book was not published for several years. During that time, I worked at jobs from retail sales to being an air stewardess, what I think you call now a flight attendant. My father had enjoyed surmising assumptions as to whom Jack the Ripper might be. These musings led me to write mysteries set in Victorian London. I found that I was totally absorbed by what happens to people under pressure of investigation. How old relationships and trust eroded and new ones formed. The Catter Street Hangman was the first to be accepted for publication and came out in 1979. I don't know how many books I wrote before that. I do remember how thrilled I was when I finally had one in print. I later began the Monk series. The series allowed me to explore a different, darker side of my characters. I also wanted to delve deeper into responsibility one holds for an act committed but not remembered. It was this aspect that intrigued me, rather than the detective work that many mysteries contain. My life as an author was very rewarding. I never married, but I enjoyed a full life and published over 100 books. Unfortunately, in December of 2022, I suffered a heart attack. My health declined after that point, and I succumbed to death on April 10th of 2023. Oh, George, Millicent let out her breath in a sigh of happiness. Isn't it beautiful? I've never been out in the park at this time of the morning before. The dawn is so romantic, don't you think? It's the beginning of everything. George said nothing, but tiptoed a little more rapidly over the wet grass. Look at the light on the water, Millicent went on ecstatically. It's just like a great silver plate. Funny shape for a plate, George muttered, regarding the long, narrow snake of the Serpentine with less enthusiasm than she. It will be like a fairyland out there. Mildred had no respect for the practical at a time like this. She had crept out through the park to sail on the dawn-lit water alone with George. What place had the literal at such a point? She picked up her skirts to keep them from getting soaked in the dew. This much was merely common sense, which was a total different thing. No one wanted the wet, heavy fabric flapping around their ankles. There's someone already out, George said with disgust. And in the broadening light, it was quite plain that there was indeed one of the small boats about 3 yards from shore, but the figure in it was curiously bent over, as if looking for something in the bottom of the boat by his feet. Millicent could hardly contain her disappointment. Where was the romance if someone else was present? Someone not part of the idol. One could pretend Hyde Park in the middle of London, where a wood in some European archicunum, and George a prince, or at least a knight, but some other mundane-minded oarsman would definitely spoil it, apart from the fact that she should not be here, unchaperoned, and a witness was not welcome. Maybe he'll go away, she said hopefully. He's not moving, replied George with annoyance. He raised his voice. Excuse me, sir, are you quite well? He frowned. I can't see the fellow's face at all, he added to Millicent. Wait here, I shall see if he will be a gentleman and move a little away. And he strode down towards the bank regardless of getting his shoes soaked, hesitated on the verge, then stumbled to his knees and slid with a violent splash into the water. Oh! Millicent was horrified, painfully embarrassed for him, and and having difficulty stifling her intense desire to giggle. "Oh, George!" She ran down the grass to where he was thrashing around in the shallows, making a fearful noise and stirring up mud without seeming to regain his feet. Extraordinarily, the man in the boat took no notice whatsoever. Then, in the fast strengthening light, Millicent saw why. She had assumed he bent forward, as had George. It was not so. His head was absent. There was nothing above his shoulders but a blood-soaked stump of his neck. Millicent crumpled into the oblivion and fell headlong onto the grass. "Yes, sir," the constable said smartly. "Captain, the Honorable Oakley Winthrop, RN, found endless in one of them little rowboats on the Serpentine. This morning about dawn, 2 young lovers off for a romantic trip." He invested the word romantic with infinite scorn. Poor souls fainted clean away. Got no stomach for the likes of that. "Not unnatural, Superintendent," Thomas Pitt said reasonably. "I should find it very worryingly if they had."
Hi, I'm Mary Higgins Clark. I was born on Christmas Eve, 1927, as the second child and only daughter of Nora and Luke Higgins. My father was an Irish immigrant. My mother was also of Irish descent, although she was born in America. I had a brother, Joseph, who was a year and a half older than I. My younger brother, John, was born 3 years later. We were a strong Catholic family. I was interested in writing even as a small child. I began writing poetry at age 6 and often created short plays for my friends. I began keeping a journal when I was 7, even if my life wasn't all that exciting. In fact, my first entry read, "Nothing much has happened today." My family owned an Irish pub, and we were fairly well off, with a home in the Bronx and a summer cottage on Long Island Sound. Nobody locked doors in my neighborhood. If my mother ever did lock the door, she'd leave a note telling everyone where to find the key. When the Great Depression began, my family was not affected at first. My parents insisted on feeding the men who knocked on their door looking for work. But by the time I was 10, my family had come to know financial trouble ourselves. Many of my father's customers were unable to pay the tabs they had run up. My father was forced to lay off several employees and work longer hours. He spent no more than a few hours at home each day. It took its toll. I'll never forget the day when I was 12 and returned from an early mass to discover that my father had died in his sleep. My family was thrown into complete turmoil. Now my mother was a widow with 3 young children to support. She learned rather quickly that not many people wanted to hire a 52-year-old woman who hadn't held a job in over 14 years. The bills needed paid, so I was forced to move out of my bedroom so that Mother could rent it out. Only 6 months after my father's death, my brother Joseph cut his foot on a piece of metal and contracted severe osteomyelitis, an infection of the bone. My mother and I prayed constantly for him. Our kind neighbors came en masse to give blood for the transfusions he needed, many, many transfusions. Despite the doctor's dire predictions, Joseph lived. I credit his recovery to the power of prayer. When I graduated from St. Xavier Grammar School, I received a scholarship to attend Villa Maria Academy. It was there that the principal and teachers encouraged me to develop my writing, although they were somewhat less pleased with me when I began spending class time writing stories instead of paying attention to lessons. At 16, I thought I was ready, and I attempted to get published. I was rejected. To help pay the bills, I took a job as a switchboard operator at the Shelton Hotel. This gave me an opportunity to listen in on the residents' conversations. I spent much time eavesdropping on Tennessee Williams, but he never said anything interesting. On my days off, I would window shop and pick out the clothes I would wear when I finally became a famous writer. But for now, my money went to help out my family. It wasn't enough. My family lost our home, and we moved into a small 3-room apartment. As soon as Joseph graduated high school in 1944, he enlisted in the Navy. He wanted to serve his country, but he also was trying to help our mother pay the bills. 6 months later, he contracted spinal meningitis and died. We mourned him deeply, but the silver lining was my mother was guaranteed a life pension and no longer needed my help to pay the bills. So I attended Wood's Secretarial School on a partial scholarship. After completing my coursework the following year, I took a job as a secretary to the head of creative in the advertising division of Remington Rand, a business machine manufacturer. I decided to take night classes to learn more about advertising. It paid off, and my job was expanded to include catalog copy. I also was given the task of modeling for company brochures alongside an unknown beauty named Grace Kelly. Everything was going well for me. Then I heard an acquaintance remark, "It was beastly hot in Calcutta." That acquaintance was a stewardess, and I wanted to visit these far-off places like she was. So I became a stewardess for Pan American Airlines, even though it meant a pay cut of $5 a week. When Remington Rand threw me a goodbye dinner, I invited my neighbor Warren Clark to be my date. I'd admired Warren for years. By the end of the evening, Warren told me, even though it was our first date, he thought I should work as a stewardess for a year and then we should be married the following Christmas. So I agreed. For most of 1949, I worked the Pan American international flights, traveling through Europe, Africa, and Asia. I made one of the last flights into Czechoslovakia before the Iron Curtain fell. At the end of my flying, I happily gave it up and married Warren on December 26th. To keep busy, I took some writing courses at NYU. Some of my classmates and I formed a writing workshop in which we would critique each other's works in progress. The workshop met weekly for almost 40 years. One of my NYU professors told the class we should develop plot ideas by reading newspapers and asking prompts, such as, "What if?" The suggestion stuck with me, and long after I was a successful author, I would still do this to come up with new ideas. For my first NYU assignment, I used this method to expand on my own experiences, writing Stowaway, about a stewardess who finds a stowaway from Czechoslovakia on her plane. My professor praised the story, but trying to get published was an exercise in frustration. After 6 years and 40 rejections, Extension Magazine agreed to purchase the story for a whole $100. I saved all those rejection letters. Yet Warren and I were very busy. Our first child, Marilyn, was a honeymoon baby, born 9 months after the wedding. Warren Jr. arrived 13 months later. In 2 more years, David followed his brother. Two months after I sold my short story, my 4th baby was born. I named her Carol after the heroine in that story. Once I sold my first story, I began getting more and more yeses. I met an agent, Patricia Meyer, and she would represent me for 20 years until she retired. We became such good friends that when my last child was born, I named her after Patricia. While Warren worked and I wrote, we encouraged the children to find ways to earn money also. All 5 would eventually take professional acting and modeling jobs. Little Patty served as a Gerber baby. David scored a national ad. Even I filmed a TV commercial for Fab laundry detergent. It aired during I Love Lucy, so Warren and I were able to take a trip to Hawaii. In 1949, Warren was diagnosed with severe angina. He slowed down and followed doctor's orders, but he still suffered 3 heart attacks in the next 5 years, each one taking more of a toll on him. After his last heart attack in 1964, Warren was unable to work again, so I called a friend who wrote scripts for a radio show to see if there were any job openings. The same day I accepted a job writing a radio segment, Warren suffered a fatal heart attack. Warren's mother, who was visiting at the time, collapsed at his bedside. So in one night, my children and I had 2 family members to bury. History was repeating itself. Like my mother, I was left to raise children alone, but I had 5 children, aged 5 to 13. My radio job gave us security, but little extra. For the first Christmas without Warren, my only gifts to my children were poems describing the things I wished I could have bought them. By the late 60s, the short story market had collapsed with fewer outlets publishing fiction. Many women's magazines were cutting back on fiction to focus on self-help articles. My agent suggested I try writing a full-length novel. I used my research and experience from the radio program I wrote to create a fictionalized account of the relationship between George and Martha Washington, called Aspire to the Heavens. It was sold for only a small advance and it wasn't successful. But it gave me the confidence that I could finish a book. 4 months later, my mother died. Encouraged by Patricia to write another book, I looked at my own bookshelves and noticed how many were mystery and suspense stories. I decided that was the direction to take. I was in the midst of writing that story when my younger brother Johnny died. I was left as the sole surviving member of my family and a widow to boot. I threw myself into my writing to relieve my grief and soon had finished a manuscript, Where Are the Children? It changed everything for me. It was purchased for only $3,000, a relatively small amount, but 3 months later, in July of 1974, I learned the paperback rights had sold for $100,000. It became a bestseller. I was 47 years old at the time. The book featured Nancy Harmon, a woman who reinvents herself, moving, dyeing her hair, and changing her name after she was accused of murdering her own 2 children. She gets off on a technicality, remarries, and starts over in a place where no one knows her past. She remarries and starts a new family. Then her 2 new children disappear and her past comes back to haunt her again. It made Time magazine's list of the 100 best mystery and thriller books of all time. When the movie was filmed, my daughter Carol, who wanted to be an actress, had a small role as a television reporter. 2 years later, I sold my second suspense novel, this time for $1.5 million. From that point on, I was a very successful writer. I kept producing mystery and suspense novels and had a series of multi-million-dollar contracts. Several of my books were adapted into movies. I became known as the Queen of Suspense. No more money worries for me. To celebrate each book and all the hard work I put into it, I would buy myself a piece of jewelry. My personal life was a little rockier. In 1978, I married again, this time to Raymond Pletz. This union was disastrous. It finally ended in 1986, and I had it annulled, and that's all I'll say about that. In 1981, I happened to be in Washington, D.C. when President Reagan was shot. I had a press pass, so I was able to join the media waiting to hear the prognosis. I was one of the few people chosen to ask a question by the doctor. Then, finally, my life took a happy turn. My daughter Patty introduced me to John J. Conheeney, and we were married in 1996. He was the retired CEO of Merrill Lynch Futures and a widower. He and his first wife, Jean, were married for 45 years. John and I met on St. Patrick's Day, and we both knew right away that we were going to be together. We married a few months later. My spouse extraordinaire, as I called him, loved accompanying me on book tours, and I expressed my gratitude and love for him in the dedications for every one of my books after we met. We were inseparable and enjoyed our large combined family. We enjoyed 22 years together until his passing in 2018. After all the struggles I had, I was determined that my children would not struggle financially and that they should have a good education. My work paid off. Marilyn and Warren both became judges. Patty worked at the Mercantile Exchange in New York. David became a CEO, and Carol authored many popular suspense novels. She developed her love for writing while retyping my transcripts. We wrote a series of Christmas-themed mysteries together. I told Carol, if someone's mean to you, you make them a victim in your next book. Carol joined me in the afterlife this past June when she died of appendix cancer at the age of 66. Patty passed away at the age of 62, not even a year after I had died. I died in January 2020 at the age of 92. I published 56 best-selling novels with millions of copies sold. 36 of those novels became movies. I even managed to hit the bestseller list posthumously with the help of my collaborator, Alifair Burke. She and I had teamed up to write the popular Under Suspicion series about Lori Moran, a TV producer with a show that revisits unsolved cold cases. The last book in the series came out the same year of my death. Alifair also helped to revisit and write the sequel to my very first suspense novel, Where Are the Children Now? It came out this year and was an instant hit. The book features Nancy and her now grown children, Mike and Missy, and a new kidnapping. I did it all by following the rules of writing as follows. No violence on screen, no four-letter words, and no nudity.
Good evening. And so, we're gathered here because you read dead people, and I, Anne Rice, am dead. If you're a fan and read the first volume of my Vampire Chronicles, Interview with the Vampire, you may recall the words of Lewis as his interview begins. I would like to tell you the story of my life then. I would like to do that very much. And this evening, so would I. I was born on October 4th, 1941 in New Orleans, the second of 4 daughters, Irish, Catholic, and my birth name was Howard Allen Francis O'Brien. I originally was told it was my mother's idea. Give a woman an unusual name and she will have an unusual advantage in the world. But in fact, it was my father, Howard. He grew up on tough streets of New Orleans, Irish Channel, and he was taunted in school. Howard, Howard, little girl, coward. He apparently thought he had a girl's name, and so he gave it to me, much to my consternation. On the first day of Catholic school, when the nun asked me my name, I told her Anne. I thought it was a pretty name. My mother said, if she wants to be Anne, then it's Anne. And she actually changed it for me legally a bit later. However, in the church, when I was 12 years old and confirmed, my full Catholic name became Howard Allen Francis Alphonsus Liguori O'Brien. It's a mouthful, it's in the registry, but I was still Anne. I loved the city of New Orleans. I think my interest in the Gothic stems from the childhood reading Bronte and Dickens and ghost stories from the New Orleans Public Library. I was a product of New Orleans. I wandered the streets, marveling at the old French buildings and wanting to catch the atmosphere, wanting to write creepy, horrible, wonderful stories and scare people. I always wanted to be a writer, but when I was 13, I wanted to be a mystic and a saint. And when I was 14, I wanted to be a nun. When I was 15, my mother died, complications of alcoholism. A year later, my father remarried and we moved to North Texas. When I was 16, I first met my husband, Stan Rice, a ferocious atheist, while we were in high school together. I graduated high school, tried one college, dropped out, briefly went to North Texas State where Stan was studying, and I became an atheist. I ran out of money for tuition, couldn't find a job, and I moved to San Francisco. A year or two later, I reconnected with Stan on a visit home to Texas. Not long after that, back in San Francisco, I received a special delivery letter from Stan with a marriage proposal. We married in 1961 in Texas. I was 20, he was almost 19. We moved back to San Francisco together, and we drank together. We had an addiction. Alcohol was our drug of choice. We were alcoholics, just like my mother. Stan finished his degree, becoming, during his life, a poet and a painter and a professor, and I earned a BA in political science. We had a baby girl, Michelle. We called her Mouse. I entered the graduate program, this time in creative writing, and did graduate with a master's degree. But during the end of my graduate studies, our Mouse was diagnosed with acute granulocytic leukemia. I had had a prophetic dream months before she became ill. I dreamt that my daughter was dying from something wrong with her blood. Michelle died shortly before she would have been 6, and I grieved her loss greatly. Not long after her death, I took a fragment from a stack of short stories and half-finished projects I'd started in my 20s. I'd originally written it one night thinking, what would it be like to get a vampire to really, really tell you what it was like to drink human blood and take human life. As I began expanding the concept into a full-length novel, a horror narrative emerged. I wrote the novel, Interview with the Vampire, during the day over a period of 5 weeks. I wrote during the day, at night I got drunk. The themes in this novel of drinking blood and being addicted to it and needing it to live mirrored the darker aspect of my life. I saw vampires as caught between the living and the dead, and they were doomed to roam around suffering thirst as if they were still living, but no amount of blood would ever ease that thirst. I wrote from the point of view of the vampire. I thought they were elegant, tragic, erotic, introspective, sensitive. They were originally human, and in surrendering, they became vampires. Lewis explains. As a man in New Orleans, I drank all the time and was at home as little as possible. I lived like a man who wanted to die, but who had no courage to do it himself. I walked back streets and alleys alone. I passed out in cabarets. I truly wished to be murdered. And then I was attacked. It might have been anyone, but it was a vampire named Lestat. He caught me just a few steps from my door one night and left me for dead, or so I thought. He sucked my blood. That is the way it is done. He drained me almost to the point of death, which was for him sufficient. I was put to bed as soon as I was found, confused and unaware of what had happened to me. He came back that night. He stepped close to my bed and leaned down so that his face was in the lamplight, and I saw that he was no ordinary man at all. His gray eyes burned with an incandescent, and the long white hands which hung by his side were not those of a human being. I think I knew everything in that instant. He talked to me and told me of what I might become. There were several acts involved. I had to watch and approve as he killed and drank the blood of a man. This was the most difficult part for me. I had no fear regarding my own death, but I had a most high regard for the life of others, and a horror of death because I had seen my brother die. I wanted to die. Kill me, I said to him. He laughed and said as a vampire I would laugh too, but he was wrong about that. I never laugh at death, no matter how often and regularly I am the cause of it. He put his right arm around me and pulled me close to his chest. I tried to move and he put his fingers against my lips and said, "Be still. I am going to drain you now to the very threshold of death." And he sank his teeth into my neck. Still holding me, I felt his teeth withdraw, and then he bit his own wrist and said, "Lewis, drink." And I did. And then I saw as a vampire. Interview with the Vampire was pretty successful and highly acclaimed, but it did get mixed reviews. 2 years after its publication, my son Christopher was born. 1 year later, my husband and I stopped drinking because Christopher did not deserve to have alcoholic parents and a life that would come with it. After that first vampire tale, I was a little bummed by the mixed reviews, and so I penned 2 researched historical novels, both of which flopped. Then I took a pseudonym and wrote the first 3 novels of the Sleeping Beauty Quartet, a series of 4 erotic novels about the Disney princess. That trilogy was included in the American Library Association's list of the 100 most frequently challenged books of the 1990s. Not quite a claim to fame. Not long after that trilogy, I wrote 2 more novels under the pen name Anne Rampling. I guess I had a thing with names. And then, after a break of about 9 years after writing The Interview, I decided to return to the vampire genre with the sequel, The Vampire Lestat. That novel did extremely well, and over the next 33 years, I wrote 11 more novels in the Vampire Chronicles series. It was important to me that my work be taken seriously, which is why, when a TV station actually asked me to interview a vampire on screen, really, I just threw up my hands in disgust and walked away. On the other hand, Sometimes I took myself and my work a little less seriously, like the times I would show up for a book signing in a coffin. After the success of The Vampire Lestat, Stan and I decided to return home to New Orleans and purchased a home on First Street in the Garden District, the setting of the first 3 volumes of The Lives of the Mayfair Witches series. I crammed that house with showcases of invaluable 19th century porcelain brew dolls, the ones with the human-like eyes, walls of books on ancient mythology and religious theory, rooms of religious statuary, and even this odd skeleton or two, outfitted in century-old bridal or ballroom gowns and sporting long, flowing blonde wigs. I was happy to be home. Now, you may recall that I said I was raised Catholic, then I became an atheist. 38 years later, at the age of 57, I returned to the Catholic faith. I had a change of heart. I decided it might be terribly important that there was a God. In that same year, I fell into a diabetic ketoacidosis coma and nearly died. Stan died 4 years later from a brain tumor. After he died, I finally took his advice, had gastric bypass surgery, and lost 103 pounds. Then I moved back to California right before Hurricane Katrina to be closer to my son. When I was in California, I wrote what critics called 2 beautiful works of historical fiction about Jesus. And then I wrote my spiritual memoir called Out of Darkness. And then I renounced organized religion again. I think much of my writing was in part a battle with my feelings about my religious upbringing, my struggle to know God, my own fears about so many things. I was always afraid of suffering and sin and hell, and I was always obsessed with death. I wrote from those places of fear. I explored my worst fears and took my protagonists right into the awful situations that terrified me. I wrote fiction, horror fiction, books of erotic content, and books of Christian literature. But when I read, well, books about ordinary people and ordinary lives and ordinary events and little bitty epiphanies, not only were they not worth reading most of the time, they were simply garbage. I preferred books that explored how we survive in a world of loneliness, ugliness, and suffering. My vampire genre novels were adapted into a comic book series, if you can believe that, a Broadway musical, and of course, films. Most famously, the 1994 film, Interview with the Vampire. I was outspoken in my criticism of casting for that film, saying Tom Cruise in the role of Lestat was no more my vampire Lestat than Edward G. Robinson was Rhett Butler. And at the time, I suggested that we nickname Brad Pitt in the role of Lewis, Barbie from Hell. I was wrong, the casting was right. Early in 2021, I announced plans to develop a TV series on the Vampire Chronicles. AMC did create the series. I understand it was pretty good. Maybe some of you saw it. I never did. I was dead. I died from complications of a stroke on December 11th, 2021, at the age of 80 in California, and I was laid to rest in the family cemetery at Metairie Cemetery in New Orleans. The 38 books I wrote and the 3 I co-authored with my son Christopher have sold over 150 million copies. Christopher maintains my Facebook page, Ann Rice. I apparently have quite a following there, and today people still read my work. Perhaps some of you in this group, after all, you're here, and you read dead people.
The accomplishment of my toils. With an anxiety that almost amounted to agony, I collected the instruments of the life around me, that I might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. It was already 1 a.m. The rain pattered dismally against the panes, and my candle was nearly burnt out, when, by the glimmer of the half-extinguished light, I saw the dull, yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive motion agitated its limbs. How can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe? Or how delineate the wretch whom with such infinite pains and care I had endeavored to form? His limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful. Beautiful. Great God, his yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of a pearly whiteness. But these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes that seemed almost of the same color as the dun white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion and straight black lips. The different accidents of life are not so changeable as the feelings of human nature. I had worked hard for nearly 2 years for the sole purpose of infusing life into an inanimate body. For this, I have deprived myself of rest and health. I had desired it with an ardor that far exceeded moderation. But now that I had finished, the beauty of the dream vanished, and breathless horror and disgust filled my heart. I am Mary Shelley. My life was as tumultuous as the monster I created in Frankenstein. I was born Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin on August 30th, 1797 in London, England, and was the daughter of philosopher and political writer William Godwin and famed feminist Mary Wollstonecraft, and who advocated for women's education. Sadly, I never really knew my mother, since she died when I was only 11 days old. My father was left to care for my older half-sister, Fanny, and myself. Fanny was Wollstonecraft's daughter from an affair she had with a soldier. My father married Mary Jane Claremont in 1801. I gained 2 more step-siblings, as my stepmother had 2 children from a previous marriage, and later she and my father had a son together. I never got along with my stepmother, and she decided that my stepsister Jane should be sent away to school, but she saw no need to educate me. Born to my parents and being introduced to the circle of writers in which they moved, I was uniquely positioned to make my own way in the literary world. While I didn't have a formal education, I did make great use of my father's extensive library and could be found reading, sometimes even by my mother's grave. During the summer of 1812, I went to Scotland to stay with William Baxter and his family, who was an acquaintance of my father. There I experienced a true family experience, unlike any I had ever known. I returned to the Baxter home the following year. In 1814, I began a relationship with poet Percy Bysshe Shelley. Percy Shelley was a devoted student of my father. Percy was still married to his first wife when he, my teenage self, along with my stepsister Jane, fled to England. Because of this, my father did not speak to me for some time. Percy and I traveled through Europe for a while. We struggled financially, and in 1815, had to deal with the loss of our first child. Our daughter only lived a few days. Later that year, I suffered the loss of my half-sister Fanny, who committed suicide. It was also around this time, thank you, that Percy's wife also committed suicide. After his wife's death, Percy and I were married in December of 1816. On the outside, I seemed devoted to my husband. However, we struggled with our marriage. Our marriage was plagued with adultery and heartache, which included the death of 2 more of our children. Percy Florence, born only child of ours that lived to see adulthood. In 1822, my husband drowned when he was out sailing with a friend in the Gulf of Spezia. Now a widow at 24 years of age, I worked to support myself and my son. I wrote several novels, including Valparaiso and the science fiction book, The Last Man. I also devoted myself to promoting my husband's poetry. Frankenstein was written when I was 18 years old and is often called the world's first science fiction novel. Sound effects. The book tells the story of a scientific genius who creates a creature constructed from dismembered corpses that torments his creator. I created the story on a rainy, sleepless night in 1816 in Geneva, where I was staying with my husband, Percy, our friend, Lord Byron, and Lord Byron's physician, John Polidori. The group, trapped indoors because of the weather, passed the time telling and writing ghost stories. But as the thunder and lightning echoed off the lake, I had a vision. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then, on the working of some powerful engine, showed signs of life. The ideas for both Frankenstein and Polidori's The Vampire were born during that stay. Some of my other works include History of a 6 Weeks Tour and Matilda. I died of brain cancer on February 1st, 1851, at the age of 53 in London. I am also buried with the created remains of my late husband's